Hello students, welcome to week 6 for Comm 308, Interpersonal Communication. This week our topics will consider power, influence, and conflict, and some things that correlate with those ideas within interpersonal communication. If you look at the week 6 agenda posted here, you'll see that we're reading chapters 10 and 11 in our Gamble and Gamble text, as well as watching 3 videos that help us understand a lot of what the course text has to say about power, conflict, and things of that nature and influence. So as we look through that, keep that in mind as you watch those videos. They display those 3 characteristics of interpersonal communication in a number of different ways. We are also working on 2 items. We're working on our theory review number 3, which I'll go over the requirements for that for this time around. And we are completing a discussion board number 6. And so that is due on Friday and your replies are due on Sunday. As we look at discussion board number 6, there's a lot of content that you see here in the slide. I'm just going to provide you a summation of that. Really, in a nutshell, you'll be writing a minimum of 400 words, drawing on a person or a situation in which you have currently experienced or have experienced in the past sometimes some type of conflict that had some sort of resolution. So what we're doing is we're looking at conflict from a very personal perspective, we're relying on a situation where we know that we've dealt with some type of conflict in the workplace personally or however it may be, and we are sharing that and then justifying it and looking at it from 3 areas that you can see listed on the slide. First thing you're doing is justifying that there was a difference in opinions, and you're looking at 5 types of perceived conflict struggle that may have ensued from the text, and that's listed under point number 1. Point number 2 asks you to describe the conflict and how the conflict could have been handled using 5 points also found within the text. And number 3 asks you to defend what points you would have used and why that may have been better looking back in hindsight in this situation. So keep that in mind as you go through that. There is a minimum of 400 words you do need to write, and your replies need to be at least 150 words each to 2 students. As we look at theory review number 3, it's important to know that we are doing the same exact thing that we did last time, except now we're going to actually write it. So in theory review number 1, we wrote it out, and theory review number 2, we did some type of video response. Now in theory review number 3, we are going back to a written response. So you are going to write in full APA style a 2 to 3 page review of a theory from one of the assigned chapters this week, or you can use any theory that we've already read about. So we're in chapter 11. We're up through chapter 11 this week. So you can pick any theory that you have not already chosen in the previous 2 to evaluate and look at in theory review number 3. The content requirements are all the same. You need to, 1, give about a third of your paper needs to be devoted to reviewing the major concepts and elements of the theory. 2, you need to analyze the strengths and weaknesses using at least 2 additional outside sources. And then 3, you need to give your personal reflection and comment on how effective you think the theory is or what it tells you that you know about communication theory and interpersonal communication as well. And so that's what we'll be doing with theory review number 3. Keep in mind that is due on Sunday, so you do have some time to do that. And you should also be working on your critical assignment as we go forward. We are in week 6 and it's not due until week 8, so you do have some time, but as you know, since our critical assignment topic selection was due last week, you were to select a film that you wanted to watch to analyze. So it's really important that you get started on that early. You give yourself plenty of time to get the film with whatever means you have to view it ahead of time, so you are good to go with that in week 8. Additionally, I will be reviewing your topics this week, and if there's a specific issue with your topic, I will contact you personally. Otherwise, you'll get your credit for that portion of the critical assignment and you will be good to go. So do not worry about your topic unless you hear from me, and that's very clear. Now we're going to move into some ideas from the chapter that I feel is very important for us to highlight as a class. When you look at chapter 10 deals with power and influence. There are four types of power that we're going to be looking at specifically today. The first two deal with expert and legitimate power. And really what this is these, if when you read through some of these definitions and we talk about it, it seems like it seems like common knowledge, things that we've all experienced because we've all experienced conflict in some point or another in our life. What we're doing now is we're just pulling these topics out and giving them a little more legitimacy to see what they are and how they relate to the areas of interpersonal communication. So for example, expert power is a person that possesses special knowledge or skills others believe they need and has an ability to influence others because of training, background, or knowledge. So having a certain amount of power because you are deemed an expert in a certain area provides you with a certain amount of power and influence over others. And that's very important to know. So what we're doing is we're defining the most common types of power that we see that relate and influence onto society or interpersonal situations. So if you're in a position at work where you have people underneath you that you manage and whatever it may be, you have a certain amount of expert power. You have a certain amount of knowledge and skills that allow you to be able to influence others because of that training, background, or knowledge. You know the job at a better degree, or you are managing them because you've worked in their position before. So that would be something deemed as an expert. The next one is legitimate power. Legitimate power deals with one's position enables him to control another. Some really have the right to exert power over us because of the roles they perform, who they are, positions held, and is often used to reduce conflict. So if somebody is using legitimate power, they may use this in a conflict situation to reduce the conflict. So if they're your boss, they may say, hey, you know what, I'm coming to you as your boss or as somebody supervising you to let you know this. And so they have legitimate power because they have the right to exert power and influence over you. We see this with law enforcement, people of high notoriety within society, things of that nature have a legitimate power or power that has been given to them to exert influence over one another to get the job done. And so expert and legitimate power go hand in hand. Normally, you see both of them used at the same time. Somebody that has legitimate power tends to have expert power, and vice versa, because you aren't put into those positions of power and influence without having specific knowledge or ability to influence those that are around you in an ethical manner. And that's really where we need to pay attention to these areas. When we look at it from an interpersonal communication perspective, we're not looking at it just to define four different types of influence and power. Really what we're looking at is to define it to understand how to ethically use those things when we're in those situations and to be ethical and Christian scholars when it comes to that. Reverent and persuasive power deals with two different things. Reverent looks at with what we do when what he requests, we need to identify, respect, or like him. So when it comes to reverent power, we take our power to utilize it, and specifically we do what he requests because one, we identify with the person, two, we respect or like the person, and three, we want that person to like us well. So really when it comes to a reverent situation, one who serves as a reverent can get us to do many things we might not be able to ordinarily do because from an interpersonal perspective or a personal perspective in general, we either one, identify with that person very closely, respect or like them, or want that person to respect and like us as well. So we're trying to the person is able to be influenced from that perspective because of how they feel about the person. And so that's really where reverent power can be used very unethically if you think about it. It's very easy for somebody to think that they can use this in a manner as a way to take advantage of how people feel about them or because they want to be liked with them and they want affirmation or things of that nature. Persuasive power is used because of the ability to persuade by conveying information and well thought out arguments. This is used very highly in speech and debate situations. And so it's where we're specifically using speech powerfully to reason intelligently. So we are persuasive with the words that we are using, and we're communicating in a way that is very persuasive to those around us. And that's really what it comes to. It doesn't use any type of expert or legitimate or reverent power. Rather, it tends to consider just using persuasion as a means to inflict influence over one another. Um, the next slide I want to look at deals with communication behaviors when we are faced with conflict. And really, we react in one of three ways. The first one is destructive. That's where there's deceitful, fail to respect others, we don't understand other point of views, and we impede a solution. So our behavior is destructive to the interpersonal situation. So we're faced with a conflict, and instead of thinking about it objectively, rather we think of it in a very destructive manner. I can't do anything. I don't want to talk to you. I'm going to storm off. Very much of what we would see in a toddler, because they lack those abilities to reason and think critically and use logic at the level of an adult, obviously. We see that in destructive behaviors as well. Constructive behaviors, when faced with conflicts, usually tries to express themselves honestly, listens effectively, and uses perception to validate techniques and appreciates a free exchange of ideas. So they are not fearful of conflict, rather they look at it as a situation to talk and work something out. And so they're constructive in the way to reduce the conflict, mitigate it, and come to a solution that's equitable for everybody involved. Desk scripts is a means of expressing feelings and understanding others' feelings in four ways. So what happens is when we're faced with conflict, sometimes this acronym is used innately without even thinking, and sometimes it's used more overtly. What we mean by that is you either one, describe how you describe the situation, how you feel, where you're at, why the conflict is affecting you. Two, you express your feelings. Three, you specify how you would like to see this resolved. And four, you acknowledge the consequences that may result within that. And that's very, very important to consider. And so those are some behaviors we look at when we see people faced with conflicts. In terms of expression, when it comes to conflict, there's really three types of expressions that we can classify all interpersonal interactions under. The first one is non-assertive. That's where somebody is very passive, fearful, or avoids conflict. So they either react in a way that is hesitant to express feelings, uses language like not really, I guess. They're trying to not express themselves in any way because they don't want to face the conflict, or they don't want to get into a conflict with somebody over some type of communication, feeling, or thought on something within society. Aggressive is when somebody will openly express their wants and ideas, often ignore or violate rights of others. Their goal is just to win the conflict and to show somebody that they were right in the situation rather than looking deeply at it. Their language is usually very aggressive in nature. They uses stare downs, they threaten, they verbally attack people. And so those are really the two differences within those areas. The third one is assertive, and this is really where we strive to get within our interpersonal interactions. It's where we communicate honestly, clearly, and directly with the person that we are having a conflict with. We tend to want to resolve the conflict, listen to the other person intently, utilizing good eye contact, saying things like I or we when they're prefacing their messages, and they are very clear and strong in their stance of how they feel about something. They don't back down from the conflict, but they're not aggressive or demeaning in any way. And it's very, very important to keep in mind as we go forward. I wanted to briefly show you something on conflict resolution and culture. I feel that this is very, very important to look at this point within the semester. So as we look at conflict resolution, it's important to know that culture plays a huge role in this. Culture and society largely influences how we respond to any given communication scenario. The text does a really good job of identifying the differences between individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures. So in the U.S. here, just as a point of illustration, we subscribe to an individualistic culture that's very it's very independent in nature, meaning that we view ourselves and society as an individual, not part of a collective group, where our decisions are based very independently from others, and very rarely can we feel that it may influence somebody else's life and things of that nature. So we prefer to deal with conflict directly, just straight up with the person that we're dealing with it. We tend to use controlling and over confronting strategies in a conflict situation. So we tend to take control of the situation and battle it out in an assertive manner. Emphasis is really given on it from an individualistic perspective. So we're thinking of how this conflict directly influences us individually outside of anything else. And we really communicate openly about whatever the situation is that we're going in. Um, when we look at it from a collectivist point of view, and this is just a point of illustration, when we get into different individualistic cultures in America, you can definitely see that there's different responses and mechanisms to deal with conflict, and a lot of that's regionally, geographically, and ethnically based on how we deal with that. But if we, for a point of comparison, compare it to a collectivist culture, it's very important to keep in mind the differences that we have there. And this is just for a point of comparison. For example, in a lot of Asian countries, particularly in Japan and Korea, they subscribe to a collectivist culture. A collectivist culture really is one that is based on valuing the needs of a group or community over the individual. Kinship, family, and community are extremely important, and people tend to work together to create harmony and group cohesion as opposed to working individually with things. So it's really important to keep that in mind. One's orientation in a collectivist culture is outward towards the group rather than inward. And shame is also part of this culture, meaning that by the way that the person conducts themselves when society makes a mistake or anything like that, they feel as if they've let the whole society or culture down rather than themselves, which is very, very, very important to keep in mind. And so when we think about that, think about if you're dealing with somebody, and a conflict would be very different. They tend to deal indirectly instead of directly. They avoid conflict in many different ways. They're focused on the group as a whole, their ethnic group, their family, their society, and the result of how the conflict would be with that, rather than thinking about it from an individual perspective. And that goes down the line with many different cultures and things of that nature. And I think it's just a very interesting point to bring up as we get into the content this week. Keep in mind as we move through it, we're working on a number of different things, but we are reading chapter 10 and chapter 11. I gave you a brief overview of some of the most important points from that chapter. We are watching the TED Talks attached, as well as Jeffrey Pfeiffer, on things about conflict, power, and influence. So it's very, very important. That's very supplementary to the reading and really will help you understand the main points. And then we're completing theory review number 3, as well as discussion board number 6. If you have any questions, contact me early on in the week, and I look forward to interacting with you. Have a blessed week.